rather were called myalgic encephalomyelitis, but chronic fatigue syndrome is the name that was given to it by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, and so there's a controversy over what you call it. But it seems to me that the fact is that it is a disease that can be characterized as being hidden in plain sight. People who have it are very ill for a very long time, and most of their lives, if not all of their lives. I, just by chance, got into it. I wrote a column. I'm a syndicated columnist at the Hearst New York Times Syndicate, and I got 200 emails, all of which began in some way, thank you. But I can tell you as a journalist, to get letters that begin thank you is novel. Indeed, you're inclined to think you might be a trick even. And this brought me into it, and gradually with an old friend in New York who's severely afflicted, Deborah Woroff, I wrote more about it, and I started a YouTube channel, MECFS Alert. We're now up to 60 little segments, 10-minute segments on the YouTube channel. I've made 4 PBS programs, part of my own program, White House Chronicle, and it is a subject that cries out. It reminds me very much of the early days of AIDS, when I was publishing newsletters at that time, and I wanted to start one on AIDS, and I couldn't find anybody who'd work on it. People thought it was something very awful and involved terrible practices between the sufferers. It wasn't until really the show business world started to say this is a huge problem, get with it, this is a health problem of major proportions, and bless her, Elizabeth Taylor's role was very important. Diseases that don't have a prominent celebrity, or a celebrity I should say, as so many do, are at a disadvantage. This one is a disadvantage, it seems to me, in every way. Its sufferers are sick, they cannot do what they want to do, they are not well suited to being heard, they suffer from dysphasia, and that is impedes their ability to have a cohesive, constant voice. They're pretty good at talking to each other, thanks to the internet, and less good at talking to the world. Newspapers, I've been in newspapers for nearly 60 years, have shown quite a remarkable, in my opinion, disinterest in this disease because it's hard to explain, etc. Somebody who wants to do something about this is Andreas Kogelnik, doctor from California, from Mountain View, who heads the Open Medicine Institute and its affiliated nonprofit, the Open Medicine Foundation, and a very remarkable young man, Ryan Pryor. And Brian, who is a patient, fairly high level of functionality, but how many pills a day do you take?
20 pills a day.
20 pills a day, if that's normal. He takes, but he came up with an idea. He said there are 3 problems here. Nobody knows about it, of course. That's one problem, so we better get some attention, and he's making, with the young lady at the back of the room, Nicole, a documentary. The other one is doctors, on the whole, don't know anything about the disease, so we better educate the doctors. He founded a thing called the Blue Ribbon Foundation, working with Dr. Kogelnik, and the plan there is that the Blue Ribbon Foundation will establish fellowships so that medical students can be embedded with specialists for a period of 10 weeks to learn something about this disease, so that they can go out into the world, essentially Manchurian candidates, if you can think of that in a kindly way, and teach and spread the word. I get an enormous amount of correspondence which says, oh, I can't find a doctor. I'm in West Virginia. We now live primarily in Rhode Island, and there's no really established doctor there. My own personal physician, when he wants information about this, he asks me. Nobody asks a journalist in their right mind for medical information. We'll tell you where to get a drink. That's about our level of medical understanding. That's the medication we've grown up with. I see the journalists are laughing. These are 2 remarkable people, and the effort here is to is to build on this idea of the embedded medical students. I have said that what is needed is to comfort the patients in every way that can be done. They feel ignored, lost. Often they're shut up in darkened rooms, cannot listen, free of sound and light in a terrible purgatory. One patient told me that she thought her bed was her coffin. Others have written to me and said they hope they don't wake up in the morning, and they pray to God every night that they will not wake up in the morning. And of course the family pressures are unbelievable. Lovers leave, wives, husbands disappear, and the burden of on the caregivers is tremendous. I'm going to ask Dr. Kogelnik to add to this. Anyway, the three things are comfort the patients, educate the doctors, and because so little federal money is spent on this disease, shame the government. Thank you, I'll repeat that. Comfort the patients, educate the doctors, and shame the government. Dr. Kogelnik. And you can sit down if you can.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But it might be better. Do you trust doctors who come on crutches?
Thank you, Llewellyn. So, about 7 years ago, I was finishing my fellowship at Stanford in infectious diseases, and I knew next to nothing, actually, about chronic fatigue syndrome. I had been through the entire medical education process. I'd done a PhD. I'd gone through pretty darn extensive training by my count. I think I went through 26th grade is how I counted it. But I saw my first chronic fatigue patient, and I didn't know it was a chronic fatigue patient. As a matter of fact, she didn't tell us that. She didn't come with a label or a sticker or a card. What she came with was a problem and an illness that she herself couldn't define. And it turned out actually that week I happened to be volunteering in the clinic, and there were two more of them. The clinic I was working in actually had a long-standing policy of not seeing these kinds of patients because this problem wasn't real. And these three had snuck in the door by not saying that they had chronic fatigue syndrome, and presented actually with some very high viral numbers that they wanted addressed. Coming down the road quite a bit, and have seen now that actually some of these cases can be treated with various drugs, but it's always a very difficult problem because this syndrome is multi-system, and we're not very good at dealing with complex multi-system diseases in medicine. We have a very great acute care system. So about 7 weeks ago, I entered the system again as a patient this time, and I get to carry this wonderful iconic symbol of patients everywhere, and that really sort of hit me back in the face of how different the challenges are for chronic fatigue patients. They don't have a symbol. I get a huge amount of sympathy. I get doors opened for me. I get cars pulled around. I get told to stay in my seat and rest rather than have somebody goes off and gets me something to drink or eat or what have you. And you contrast that to the situation that these patients are in. They come in with tremendous disability, cognitive dysfunction, physical dysfunction. They can't sustain any activity. The disease spans the gamut of socioeconomic, of ethnic proportions. I've seen pretty much every race, creed, color in the 7 years I've been at this. I have VCs on Sand Hill Road who are affected. I have patients who are teenagers and can't even stay in high school. So the breadth of the disease is tremendous, and the understanding of physicians is actually in many ways appalling. When I went into private practice after leaving Stanford and started the institute and a clinic, my colleagues in the community turned to me and said, "We are so glad you're doing this because we don't want to deal with these patients because we don't know what to do for them." It wasn't that they didn't care, it was just that the system of both reimbursements and service wasn't setting them up to take the time to look through these patients, and the education system hadn't prepared them for it either. So we as physicians have a lot to do to understand and be empathetic with these patients to try and fix that part of the system. So fast forward now to 2014. I think the field has changed dramatically in the last few years, but we have a long way to go. There's been a lot more scientific work, but that's been hampered tremendously by lack of funding. Most of our funding in our institute actually comes from private sources, and that's a telling statement. And yet, even with that and other groups as well, we're starting to make headway in terms of finding markers and immunologic differences in these patients. So I think the take-home messages are we need a tremendous re-engagement with physicians and re-education of physicians. We need more funding for research and more attention to what is very clearly a disease that can be defined, or maybe a set of diseases that can be defined at a molecular level. And we need a lot more support for patients with these chronic illnesses. I personally think that these chronic illnesses, and there's a constellation of them, represent a tremendously ignored portion of healthcare, ranging from autism on the low age end of the spectrum up to chronic fatigue and a host of other neuroimmune diseases that we don't deal with very well in medicine. And we need to, because they cost billions of dollars in economic damage. Llewellyn already highlighted the personal damage in terms of lost relationships, lost jobs, and so forth. So I hope that we can move the field forward and increase awareness over the coming years, and certainly we're driving the research in that direction. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
I'm Brian Pryor. I'm a journalist formerly with Newsweek and the Daily Beast and with USA Today. Now I am a documentary film producer. I'm the executive producer of a film called The Blue Ribbon with Nicole Castillo, who's filming in the back. And we also have a nonprofit called the Blue Ribbon Foundation, which will do the engagement, social engagement associated with the film. And I'm president of the Blue Ribbon Foundation, and Nicole is the director of that. My personal story begins that I, like one of the patients that he talked about, a high school student who couldn't stay in school. I came home from cross-country practice on October 22nd, 2006, slept for 16 hours, did the same thing the whole rest of the week. Within 2 weeks, I had totally dropped out of school, and pretty much had 3 or 4 different teachers, a whole team of their teachers coming straight to our house, teaching me by bedside or by if I was able to sit up for a few minutes at the table. And that's how I got through my junior year of high school. And that's pretty common for many patients who become totally bedridden, or it takes 6 months at least to get the diagnosis of what they call chronic fatigue syndrome. And so I eventually found a doctor that understood it and was able to help me. And like I said before, I take about 20 pills a day now. Give myself a shot once a week, and I get an IV treatment once a month, and that keeps me in the game. But I'm only functioning at about 90%, and I do have crashes pretty regularly, I think, especially if I overdo it. So I shared my story for the first time publicly in 2012. I had written a number of essays for English professors that were only read by the English professors, but I decided to write about it more publicly right around the time when the XMRV, which is a retrovirus that we thought was causing it, and Ian Lipkin from Columbia University published a study that definitively said that that was not the case. And I stepped forward, and that was a good news peg to go ahead and write an op-ed sharing my experience with chronic fatigue syndrome. And the response was tremendous. I had been a journalist for about 1 year on the national media scene, and like he talked about writing for 60 years. The response was tremendous, and so it gives me a lot of comfort knowing that I could write for several more decades and never get a story as good as this. So we decided to set out and do a documentary on this subject. I think the same story was true with David Toller from the New York Times. He said that he had never had a story that had resonated in the blogosphere so much is this series of stories he wrote for the New York Times on chronic fatigue syndrome. So I think it's an extremely important story nationally, and the few of us who have ventured out on the limb to talk about it have gotten tremendous responses. So we've been working on the film for 6 months so far. We've filmed in 7 states at some of the leading neuroimmune institutes in the world. And what we're seeing every day in the labs, and the clinics, and the institutes is boundless optimism. Very innovative, dynamic research in neuroimmune diseases through big data, translational medicine, gene expression. What's in molecular medicine? What's happening here in chronic fatigue syndrome is going to change a lot in many other diseases. So we call this film the Blue Ribbon MECFS in the future of medicine. The idea of being an MECFS is a complex chronic disease, and it will be sort of the ultimate poster child for the kind of in-depth, extensive research that we finally now have the technology to sort through, and that'll help with other diseases like cancer and AIDS and et cetera. So as part of the outreach for the film, we have a program called the Blue Ribbon Fellowship. The idea for that is to install medical students between the first and second year of medical school at some of these leading institutes, and for about 8 to 10 weeks, so a paid summer internship essentially. And it'll help reinvigorate the field. I think that we've had pretty extensive interest among students, among the institutes, and among people who are looking to start clinics and want to hire a MECFS or neuroimmune doctor, and this will be a good training program to get those people out there. The patients tend to often wait 2 or 3 years to see one of the experts like Jose Montoya at Stanford or Dr. Bateman in Utah. And so this is an important thing to help relieve the massive strain on the waiting list that the established clinics already have. So we want to have a program that's sustainable, scalable, has measurable endpoints, it's attractive for students, and it's productive for the labs, the clinics, and the institutes. So something that would be sustainable would be something financially sustainable for the future. It was scalable. We want to start probably with about 5 clinics, 5 students at 5 sites probably, with the idea being to scale up. Something that's attractive for students, which would be primarily, getting a paid stipend is one part of it. The other part of it is the importance of getting something that they can present or possibly publish. That'll help them with their resume and help them move forward toward applying for fellowships and for residencies. And productive for the labs, the clinics, and the institutes. I think that a number of these institutes have a whole stack of work that they need help with, and it will be very easy for them to find, to get a student involved on a particular project that fits the student's interest. So we really hope that this will reinvigorate the field and help get more people who are able to treat complex chronic diseases. And so I'm happy to answer questions about my experience as a patient, about our nonprofit, about the foundation, and about what we've seen with our documentary so far.
And I think we'll go right to questions. Yes, Don.
Ryan, how do you plan to recruit the students?
Through through medical school listservs is one way. Through a lot of the interests I think that we've had so far would be from people who have family members who are afflicted, and those people have a very best personal interest, and I think those would be the easiest way besides directly appealing to them through the medical schools.
Just wondering how that would mesh with their specialty training or their intended specialty training, since there isn't really a specialty here.
Yeah, so between the first and second year of medical school is often considered the last free time that a medical student has, and so that is the prime time to get them. A lot of people by their 3rd or 4th year really have a good sense of if they want to go into gastroenterology or infectious disease. When they're still getting their feet wet in the first year, they're still moldable, and a lot of these people who do have an interest in studying MECFS, that might have been beaten out of them by their 4th year, but they really, when they're a little bit more impressionable early on, and we do have that free summer to take advantage of.
Andy, I'd like to ask you, what is the reaction you receive from your colleagues in the medical profession?
Well, I think in terms of clinical practice, as I said, sort of many of them are glad that there are places that they can refer patients to, but those places are actually few and far between. There's really, a handful, maybe a dozen clinics or so that are reasonably well known for managing patients like this. And I think one of the big problems, and one of the reasons I'm glad Ryan's doing what he's doing, is that actually a lot of those clinics are run by physicians who will probably all retire within the next 7 years. And there are not that many younger physicians doing this, because the rewards for going out into private practice in general are becoming slimmer, and without broader recognition of the disease itself, many of the larger institutions don't manage the condition and basically refer patients to psychiatry or other places, which doesn't help manage the disease. So the physicians, as I said earlier, do need some re-education and help with understanding the disease. But many of them are, as I said, are very glad to have additional folks to manage patients, because the complexity of these patients is just immense.
So in 50 states, we have less than 12 or about 12 specialist clinics.
Focused solely on this disease, that's right. There are other physicians, functional medicine type physicians and so forth, who see these kinds of patients, but by and large, the average primary care physician in the U.S. is not equipped to deal with this.
How big is the patient population?
Well, 8 million worldwide are the current estimates from a number of different sources. Many people think that that's actually a gross underestimate, because there's actually no benefit to reporting. And I actually agree with that, because I don't use, there is an ICD-9 code, which is the diagnostic coding for medical conditions. I actually don't use that in my practice when I write out a super bill, because it's a scarlet letter that you put on a patient that they then carry with them to anything that they do, and they do get discriminated against for that. So any patient who sees me won't actually get that as an official diagnosis on their chart. We categorize it under other problems that they have, but we typically don't put that directly in the chart, and many other physicians do the same, because it just creates problems for the patient.
Speaking of that, do you think that other entities like chronic Lyme disease and Gulf War syndrome are really all the same thing? Are we talking about the same?
I would say they're not the same thing. They probably are on the same spectrum, and we are looking at autism, Lyme. We're not doing so much with Gulf War, but there's a host of different diseases that are all aligned, and probably from a scientific standpoint are following some of the same immunologic pathways. I think all of these conditions are sort of problems with stress tolerance. So the individual gets overwhelmed by something, and that thing could have started from a genetic predisposition, it could have started from an environmental exposure, it could have started from a pathogen like a virus. But there's any number of ways that those can build, and I think there's a lot of challenges within that, in what we're doing societally, in the environment, and so forth, that may be helping to drive that dietarily. There's all kinds of things going on that may be making patients more sensitive to these kinds of diseases.
Yes, please, Laurie.
These are broad questions, but how do you diagnose it at this point, and how do you treat it?
Yeah, so the diagnostic criteria are a little bit all over the map. There's several different case definitions. They are all somewhat overlapping, but the basic criteria are 6 months of illness with disabling, with a cluster of symptoms, and I'm happy to get you the list, but it's a relatively lengthy list, and you pick essentially 6 from that list, and you have chronic fatigue. So it's a very syndromic type diagnosis. Those symptoms, Llewellyn mentioned them at the beginning, but could include fatigue, cognitive dysfunction. Ryan mentioned exercise intolerance, so what we call post-exertional malaise, headaches. There's overlap into various pain syndromes, so joint pain and muscle pain. Some patients will have lymphadenopathy that's transient, it comes and goes. So that most of them will have sleep and GI disruption. So the sleep patterns have been very well documented to be completely abnormal. But the case definition actually focuses purely on the symptoms. So it's you have these symptoms for 6 months and you have the disease. So what we're working on the research side is actually redefining the disease on a molecular level. And there's an Institute of Medicine meeting on Monday. They've started to convene a committee to look at chronic fatigue and try to establish yet another stamp, approved definition for the disease, which hopefully will help to move the field forward. But we'll see what comes out of that whole discussion. But I think the key is that we do need to get in and define it on a molecular level, perhaps to enable some of these things to move forward.
I'll add to that the idea would be to get past diagnosing via symptom and getting toward pathology. Personally, I have low natural killer cell function and low heightened levels of human herpes virus 6. I'm an acute onset patient, and that's almost as close to a classic case as you can get.
So,
How do you treat that? What kind of medicine?
Sorry. So we treat patients basically depending on how they come out in terms of profiling them, right? Some patients look more immunologic, some patients look more like an exposure. Probably the biggest slice of that pie is, as Ryan suggested, viral. We think it's probably about 40 to 60% of in terms of at least the patients that we've seen. But that's part of the problem is nobody's done a big survey. So in treating those patients, you try to manage each one of those things. So if they have a viral type onset, you might treat them with an antiviral. If they have a more immunologic basis, you might go after immune boosters, nutritional supplements, and so forth. And there is no real standard of treatment, standard of care around treatment. And that's one of the problems, because you haven't defined the disease, so how do you define a treatment process? And with so many systems involved, a lot of physicians wind up treating symptomatically. They'll treat the gut, they'll treat the sleep issues, they'll treat the immunologic issues as best they can, but it's a real challenge. And my area is really genomics and outcomes-based measures, so we're trying to redefine how patients respond to these and actually put some solid scientific measurements behind that, so that we can say, look, Ryan or whoever was treated with an antiviral and their symptoms got better over this period, but let's measure what's going on in them molecularly and use that to guide treatment. So that's, I think, where we're going.
I was one of the issues that I have is that I respond very well to methylcobalamin, methylated B12, and there's a specific gene that determines whether or not you can process folate, and then if you do not have that gene, then the way that you fix it is through injecting yourself. I inject myself weekly with methylated B12, and it helps a lot. And so he's doing a genetic study to figure out exactly what's going on there.
Yeah. So there's, I think the etiology-wise, there may be some genetic states that are predisposed to having problems, and the MTHFR is the gene that Ryan's talking about, which is a folate pathway that the methylated B12 boosts, essentially. And so we're actually just starting a study around that, with several hundred patients, 100 to 200 patients that we'll do through that as a controlled trial. There's a lot of those kinds of studies that need to happen in and around the various treatments that are tried in some of these clinics. We're part of, we actually manage 7 clinics now as part of a CDC study. And the one thing we learned in the first year of that study is that everybody does things very differently. There's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how these clinics function, because they're independent practitioners scattered across the US, and actually now we have a couple of other international sites as well. And there is no good standard of care around these patients. Many of us do the same kinds of things, which is good, and now more of us are talking amongst ourselves, but there is no federal leadership around that. CDC's been helpful in terms of corralling that and collecting that information to at least give us that sense that we have differences between the way we practice. I spend a lot of my time doing that in general in medicine, measuring anything we do, taking biological samples and so forth, and it's really striking across a lot of these diseases. Lyme disease, you mentioned as well, and autism as well, so we actually have big projects in both those areas around some of the same issues. And I think it's really striking how we do not we, the medical establishment, have failed to measure what we do in any meaningful way across hundreds of different diseases. And the data is there, we just have to start collecting it. The challenge is that physicians are not incented to collect it, and they're not incented to innovate around their own practices, which is why these practices are the exception to the rule. So the average physician visit in the US is 18 minutes. Its average time to interruption of a physician, of a patient when they see their doctor is 18 seconds. And in 18 minutes, one of these chronic diseases, no way, you can't deal with it. Right? There are too many problems. These patients come in with a laundry list of problems because they have so many different systems affected. You can't deal with sleep, gut, headache, pain, so forth in one visit. So these patients will come back and come back and come back, and you sort of start to deal with them one at a time, but the acute care system won't let them come back that often, right? Because we have limits in terms of what the insurance companies will cover, in terms of all these coverages. So the patients that tend to do better are the ones who are either less ill, or the ones who can afford to come back and afford the care on their own, because the measurable part of the system won't allow them to get the care that they need. And when they do, even when they do, there aren't really that many treatments available.
I'll add to that Obamacare is one of the, obviously the biggest story in healthcare right now. And one of the interesting things about doing this documentary is that over the last 6 months of reporting the story, basically nobody's mentioned Obamacare from the physician perspective, the research perspective, or the patient perspective. And the reason is that Obamacare does not affect us one way or the other, because it's not covered by insurance in the first place. And so this is 1 million patients in the US who are who will be kind of out of luck either way. And I think that there's a reason why our social security system or disability system is under such financial stress. And it's these complex chronic diseases are a big part of that. And so in order to really become more fiscally solvent, I think we need to take a good look at this stuff.
I would agree with that. I think there's a huge economic issue here. The numbers for any one of these neuroimmune diseases are skyrocketing. You look at autism, that went from less than 1 in 1,000 patients to 1 in 50 in some states today. Chronic fatigue is around 1 in 300 patients. Lyme disease, that was just upregulated last year by the CDC from 30,000 cases per year to 300,000, order of magnitude that they shifted it, and that even those are probably still underestimates, because we are not measuring well across the population.
What's the connection with autism? It's the first I've heard that.
I don't think anyone's fully established the connection properly. Many of the symptoms actually overlap. I think it's actually a version of the same disease in a child who's trying to go through developmental milestones, right? If you had headache, joint pain, GI disruption, and couldn't sleep, and you were 2 years old trying to learn your ABCs, darn well you're not going to learn your ABCs real well, and you're not going to be able to speak really well. And I have adults with cognitive dysfunction. I can only imagine what that's going on in a child, under 8. So I think there is an overlap. It probably is not. And autism has the same problem. The definition of an autistic child is complicated. We don't have a test that we can run to say, yes, you are autistic, or yes, you have chronic fatigue, or even yes, you have Lyme disease, definitively. And that's a huge problem. So, but I think symptom-wise, there is a huge overlap. Immunologically, what we've seen and measured so far, there are overlaps and there are parallels, and we're digging into that pretty solidly.
Ryan, one of the things that's fascinated me in my reporting has been how so many patients, the majority that I've spoken to, know the exact day, month, and year that they were first ill. I don't know any other disease where it's so pronounced that they know the time.
Sometimes even the exact minute when it happens, 7:10 in the morning, we get that. Yeah.
Is there a reason for that?
He might know but I do know that.
Have you encountered that, Andy? I find that very extraordinary that there is this exact memory recall of when things changed seminally?
I think the reason for that is actually has less to do with the onset of the illness as it does with the devastation that it wreaks. If your life ended, so to speak, and your functional life ended, you would remember when that was. So the patients that typically, in my experience, know that are the ones who have the most abrupt onset. So a lot of the viral patients will describe that. There are probably, I'd say, about 30% of the patients that are a little more insidious, that they gradually declined to those levels. But many of the patients, particularly, as I said, the viral ones, will say, okay, yep, Thursday, April 14th, 89, I came down with the flu and I never recovered. And they know because they've been counting the days, right? They were fully functional up until that point. And all of a sudden they can't do their job, they can't go to school, they can't, be a parent or a husband or wife or whatever. And many of them are completely bedridden.
And when they're sick, it's not a constant state, is it? It goes up and down. My friend who I mentioned at the beginning, she contracted it in 1989, but her two bedridden years were 2003 and 2004, substantially after she was diagnosed, and she was an athlete who could never do any of the athletic things again, period. Can't to this day, of course. But she had this particular period which was worse. And I think the same thing is seen in the woman who wrote, Tover, I think is her name, who wrote the book, The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating, who was, this is a fascinating story. She wrote a little book, a wonderful little book, about watching a snail. She was bedridden. She couldn't watch television. She couldn't deal with light. But somebody gave her a terrarium which had a snail in it, and she watched the snail for 2 years and became an expert on snails. And with it came to a very interesting conclusion that maybe modern science is too quick to put things under an electron microscope. And there was a lot to be said for the 19th century naturalists who just looked, because they didn't have electron microscope, looked and listened, and that's kind of fascinating. It's a wonderful read. It's about the snail and the strange goings on. Do you know that a snail can have sex with itself happily?
Andy, can I ask you about any knowledge you may have about international affliction? There's one doctor I know that we've spoken to before who says that he calls it the Scandinavian disease because it tends to affect Scandinavians. Have you found that?
Well, as I said before, I think we've seen patients from all over the world, and pretty much every ethnic group and so forth. There may be pockets that are related in terms of etiology. As I said, I think there probably are multiple triggers. In Australia, for example, there are outbreaks of MECFS around Ross River virus, which is a virus that's endemic to Australia. It's just one more example of a trigger that causes a cascade of immunologic responses that are abnormal. And whether it's human herpes virus 6 or Ross River virus or a non-virus, we don't know. And that's part of the challenge here. So I think there may be regional things like that that are creating regional problems, right?
Yeah.
Our current awareness in the U.S. in large part stems from an outbreak in the Lake Tahoe area in the 1980s that Dan Peterson uncovered essentially, which is just an amazing story, but was sort of swept under the rug. But he has clusters of teachers who use the same break room, sports teams. There's multiple all over the country. There's been several outbreaks in sports teams, orchestras, flight attendants. Actually, there was a huge in LA in the 80s and 90s. There was a huge, actually I think a lawsuit came out of it around flight attendants who'd come down with this, and it was called yuppie flu back then. It just devastated this one group of flight attendants that obviously all were in communication with one And that's one of the challenges of this disease, is because there are clusters and ties from an infectious standpoint, and yet we have singleton cases. I mean, most of my cases are one person affected in the family, and they can be severely affected, and yet no one else will be. But I have entire families that come in, and all of them are affected. So epidemiologically, it's a fascinating story, but darned if we know exactly what it is yet from that standpoint. And I think that goes back to what I was saying before, that this multi-system, multi-factor issue, right? One person in the family may not have taken their B12 or their vitamin D enough, and so it becomes an exposure issue. Were you exposed to enough? What were you exposed to? What were the other stressors on your body at the time of exposure? And certain environments may predispose to that.
Wasn't one of those outbreaks called Iceland, it led to the name Iceland disease? That may be what your person was talking about in the Scandinavia, that's not really Scandinavia.
Well, and it's interesting when you look sort of at the ethnography of this, that different cultures have come up with different names around this. The Japanese have a whole subculture around this.
What do they call it?
You know, I don't
Low natural killer cell disease, or low natural
Well,
killer cell
that's more
syndrome.
recent. Actually, it's been going on for a while, and there was another name for it. I can't remember now. Yeah, I mean, they put it in a whole other category by itself. And now, as Ryan indicated, they're starting to look at the immunologic components as others have uncovered those.
We haven't mentioned that predominantly it's a disease of women, isn't it?
Yeah, it's probably about 60 to 70% women, I can guess at that. My best guess at the moment, there clearly are hormonal ties, both in males and females. Many women are triggered around, and the severity of their symptoms are triggered around hormonal changes. I've seen patients come in having been triggered from pregnancy, from puberty, from hormone replacement or hysterectomies, and males as well. We have a number of males with hormonal disruption. Some of that actually ties back to the XMRV story, may be indicative of viral transfer, in that some of the viruses, as they traverse through our populations, they land on our DNA and they pick up things. And one of the things that they appear to have picked up are androgen receptors, which are hormonal receptors. We have a lot of research to do to get in there and understand that, but that may be why when hormone shifts happen in the body, we see, some of these remnant pathways being activated or deactivated depending on whether those viruses are there or not. But that's purely theoretical.
Magic bullet drugs. Everybody is safe with any disease hopes that there is a magic bullet about to be discovered. Two names float around and have been applied in very small ways, as far as I know. Rituxan, which is a cancer drug, used off-label sometimes, and Ampligen, which is perpetually in trial.
Yeah. I would love to have a magic bullet for this, and I think hopefully someday we will. But neither of those drugs, in my view, is a magic bullet. I think they're both, and maybe some of the antivirals as well, represent a lot of hope in the community, and there certainly are some strong responders with some of those drugs. But again, we have to figure out who is most appropriate to get those drugs, and why do they respond to those drugs? And I think that actually is one of the avenues that is most promising in terms of figuring out what the change is on a molecular level. Why do some patients respond? Those are measurable things that we can look at a molecular level and say, aha, patient X responded to Ampligen, or patient Y responded to Valsite, or patient Z responded to Rituxan. And we can actually measure those changes immunologically from a gene expression level and say, yep, here they were before, here they are when they're fixed, and what are the commonalities across those pathways. That's work that we're doing some work in that area, as are others, and hopefully that will come out in the next year or so.
So a lot of people want to get a cure or a silver bullet, but oftentimes that's going to be impossible or a long way off. And it's also really important to emphasize an incremental approach to give people hope in the here and now. If you improve someone's functionality by 1 or 2 hours in a given day, you've radically change their life. And so what I get a lot of inspiration from is researchers who are talking about cures, which may be 10 years away. They're talking about how can I improve patients 10% within this year. And that's another, one of the interesting studies is the B12 study, but there's plenty of other ones that are ongoing to prove that smaller interventions can help you. And so I'm the example of someone who may never be cured of this, but I can certainly manage it, and that's a really important point to make.
I will say though that we have seen cures. There are patients who have been treated and get well, and there are some who get well on their own after, pretty lengthy illness. Unfortunately, they're in the minority, and as Ryan, I think, correctly says, there's a level of fragility to most of these patients around their immune system that, and their stress response that persists for a long time. And until we identify the driver of that persistence, they will continue to be fragile and continue to have difficulties. And I think the idea of a cure tomorrow is certainly not realistic. We've taken, 40 years and only been able to turn HIV into now a very chronic, manageable disease. But that's been an intense 40 years. I mean, that history gives us most of what we know about viruses. Before the 1980s, we knew next to nothing about viruses. And still, we're actually way in the dark on them. So I think there's a lot to be studied yet to get to that point.
John?
I like the multiple etiologies that might affect the whole diagnosis of chronic fatigue, but affect the whole body. The sensitivity, genetically, some people have more than others to various exposures, either viral or substance, and the toxicity that on top perhaps of the sensitivities. But in identifying some of these exposures, I think it helps in the literature and as a community to start identifying some substances or things that people could recognize and avoid. And we had mentioned earlier about the volatile hydrocarbons, propellants, glues, that some people react to more than others. And if it gets out in the general knowledge in medicine, at least for some people, to recognize that this is a possibility and to avoid it, avoiding further exposure, that can help that segment. And if we didn't identify other things that people can identify and avoid and help them as well, to help this whole segment by segment.
I agree with you. I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying before, is that we need to measure better to figure out what those things are. Right? We as physicians, I'll see a patient once every 3 months, once a year sometimes. There's a tremendous amount of things that happen in that year to that patient. Dietary changes, environmental exposures, stress levels, pathogen exposures, and we measure next to none of it, and as I said before, expect the patient to somehow summarize that in less than 18 minutes for us. So we're working on some things from an IT standpoint to allow patients to kind of enter that information and let us capture it for research, but also for their clinical care, and summarize that for physicians. So that would be useful. Certainly in the autism community as well, that's a huge issue, right? What were these kids exposed to? What dietary issues are going on there, and that there's some perhaps clearer than the adults issues going on there, and they need to be measured just as well.
In line with the aggravating substances, as John just mentioned, a lot of patients seem to suffer or believe that they are affected by mold. I've heard from a lot of people who've moved to the Southwest, two who live in trailers that they built themselves to avoid any substances that they thought would antagonize their disease, and report good results.
Some of those are anecdotal, but I think there's enough of them that needs to be examined again much more clearly. There's a group actually out of the East Coast here that's done some clean room studies with some really interesting results where they put patients in a clean room and fed them a very restricted diet for 2 weeks and reduced their exposure to all kinds of things. And they have some pretty interesting results that show there can be benefit from isolating patients that way and sort of cleaning up their immediate environment. That some people are just more sensitive that way. Whatever pathways have been turned on, biologically to make that happen need to be understood better.
There is a myth, partly politically driven, that all research is being undertaken by pharmaceutical companies, that they're in the front line of everything to do with medicine. Are they working on possible drugs for CFS?
I think there's few and far between that are interested at the moment in CFS, which somehow surprises me every time I look at this, because most of the pharma companies are looking for chronic diseases now, because what better way to sell a drug than if you have to sell it for the lifetime of the patient rather than for an acute problem, right? The challenge is for infectious diseases, actually, most pharma companies are moving away from ID as a development area because the drugs have a limited lifespan of about 18 years. So after investing several $100 million into the development of a drug, 18 years later they have nothing, right? Because of bacterial resistance and misuse by physicians or patients and so forth. And there's always the patent issues after a while, the patents expire as well. But yeah, I think the development in CFS is few and far between. Mostly what we're looking at are repurposing existing drugs, and we've been actually pretty successful at that. But we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, and certainly pharma funding would be most welcome in this kind of environment where we need to do some of these bigger trials. We need to do more measurement. And there's a lot of good candidates actually out there that we're slowly tapping into.
One of the tough things about doing research, particularly for pharmaceutical companies, is they need tangible, measurable endpoints. And a lot of the research has been, if you base it off of a symptom, then you do questionnaires that say, did your headaches improve, did your fatigue improve, did your sleep problems improve, and it's subjective. And so as we move more and more toward tangible, measurable endpoints, for instance, natural killer cell function or certain levels of viruses, that gives them something a little bit more tangible to shoot at. Like you were saying earlier, that we can develop more targeted drugs, but we need a target in the first place.
And that definitely has been a difficulty in selling trials, so to speak, to any potential funders, is that we're still arguing over definitions in some ways, and that makes it all the more complicated. Especially, I think in general, to put on my personalized medicine hat, which I spend a lot of time in, defining some of these chronic illnesses at an individual level is critical to moving the field forward. And the federal agencies, FDA, for example, struggles with that right now too. What, in this era of genomic medicine, what does it mean to approve a drug that you can personalize that therapy down to an individual level? Right? Who do we approve this for, and why, and what, and how do we titrate that? And of course, FDA is concerned about how do we make sure that that stays safe for an individual. They don't know how to do that, and I think there's various strategies within the agency to try to get a handle on this, but it makes it even more complicated when we move from acute diseases to chronic diseases, where you have multiple systems affected and lots of different things going on in an individual patient. So it's a huge challenge from a regulatory standpoint, as well as from a pharma standpoint, just dealing with this whole personalized medicine era. And they're all of them are sort of scratching their heads and struggling to figure that out, as are physicians. Physicians are overwhelmed. I have patients coming in to me actually somewhat regularly, with their genome sequenced or their 23andMe readout or what have you, and most physicians weren't trained to even think about these things, let alone interpret them. And here's this wall of information coming at the physicians and the patients as well. I give a talk where I have a line of the familiar Moore's Law curve, which is the processing power in microprocessors that doubles every 18 months. You look at that and you compare it with storage costs plummeting over the last 20 years in terms of data storage. Then you look at the biological side and you see our sequencing capacity doing the same thing as Moore's law. And then you look at next generation sequence and the curve just got steeper, right? So all of a sudden last year we started generating data faster than the storage is expanding to hold it. So that's a problem. But that means we have more data on patients potentially than we've ever had before. If you look at the curves, the amount of clinical data we had on patients up until about 5 years ago in terms of biological sampling and so forth just went like this. So all of a sudden we can generate 3 terabytes of sequence data on any individual for, argue your price somewhere between $2,000 and $10,000, and those prices are dropping. That's a huge amount of data, and we're just getting into the analytics of those things. So for a community physician to deal with that when they see a patient walking in the door, forget it, right? 18 minutes, you haven't even covered the first, 18 hours with that kind of data. So we have to think about some different paradigms for disease in general, not just chronic fatigue, but I think chronic fatigue is a fantastic example, a model system, if you will, for how we need to deal with chronic diseases in general in the healthcare system, and our failings to do so. It really, I think, is a shining example on all fronts of that.
Susan?
Just a quick question. Are you able to quantify the money that is needed to try to move this illnesses? And I hear you that it's many chronic illnesses. We have the possibility of really cracking something here. I know that Tony Fauci in the 1980s from the National Institutes of Health said for AIDS, he reached for the stars and said 40 million. But without that, we wouldn't be where we are with AIDS. What, as you as a doctor, scientist, what would you ask for?
I think that's a fascinating question and a fascinating answer on the HIV front, because of course far more than 40 million has been spent on HIV research in the last several decades. Matter of fact, probably more like 40 billion. Emory just sold an HIV drug that they developed a year ago or so to, I think it was to Gilead for it was about $1 billion, 1.2 billion if I remember correctly. So in terms of that immune response and how did your body deal or not deal with that. But yeah, I think part of our efforts are focused on trying to measure those things and develop some better measures for the viruses themselves.
I was kind of thinking more of people who actually come down with mono
Yeah.
and are wiped out for weeks and then maybe get better, but then.
What do we do post-mono, right? There's this whole segment of patients that get their tonsils taken out post-mono because they're sick, right? But actually, if you look at the long-term impact of that, most of those patients don't get along, by 6 months they're back to the same place. And yet we don't take that tissue and do anything with it. It gets thrown away. So we're actually doing some studies now, working with EMTs to get some of those tissues and measure those. We're looking at oral viral levels and see if that's an indicator of at least a subset of patients who are doing worse. But it's all goes back to measurement, and whether you're talking about EBV or any host of other potential pathogens that have been suggested, we need to measure them, and we don't have the funding to do that properly, and we don't have the educated people, scientists or physicians. I think there's more that are getting interested all the time, especially over the last couple of years, but we really need larger engagement.
DePaul University's just got to do a study on this, that they're going to see however many people got mono in the university health system, and they could track these people over time. And it'll be very interesting to figure out which percentage of them never get better, and then it'll be a certain percentage, and it'll help sort out that problem.
I think that concludes for today, unless there's a final question. But both Ryan and Andy will be here for the next 25-30 minutes if you want to talk to them privately. And I want to thank you all very much for coming. Greatly appreciated, and particularly our two panelists. Andy came all the way from California, and Ryan up from Georgia. And thank you so much for being here. This is a really major story of our time that is undercovered.